All right, so I'm going to try to do this without the mic. If it ever gets to be too quiet in the back, or if you can't hear me, let me know. I can start to use this microphone that's kind of wearable, so when I'm moving around. In fact, let me just do something real quick. Okay, make sure the audio is going. Trying something a little bit different than the first class. So before we kind of jump into things, usually at the beginning of class, I'll kind of give like a little bit of a summary or kind of like what, where we're at, kind of review some assignments, due dates, things like that. Right now, we don't really have a whole lot going on. Gotten some emails from some of you. I tried to get back to you, but I also knew I was going to address it today. So when I mentioned posting that first kind of module reading that we can see on Top Hat, I said it wasn't for any points. So usually, and a lot of you correctly heard this part, I usually assign those module readings before we cover the material the following week. I wasn't going to assign something before the semester started. So that's why kind of week one or module one, chapter one, I was just making it available day one. It wasn't for any points. And when you're trying to look at those embedded questions, some of you couldn't answer them, right? That's because it wasn't assigned as an assignment. So after today's class, you'll see that second module pop up. That one you should be able to answer the questions, right? Because I'm going to actually assign it as a homework assignment, okay? So after class today, I'll kind of release module 2. It'll show up on Top Hat. It'll also show up down here under module 2, which should now be visible to you on Canvas. You can't see the assignment, but you can see these other materials that I've published. As soon as I publish that module reading or that assignment, you'll see the link there as well, okay? So the very first module reading you have is for module 2. There wasn't one for module 1. I just released module 1 so you can review the e-test. Okay. We'll kind of pick up where we left off in the slides from last class. We'll actually be covering more content today, not really just the syllabus expectations. We kind of got all of that out of the way. But that very first quiz will also be released at 11 a.m. today after I'm done teaching my 2 sections. That will be about half of those questions. So it's a 12 question, but about 6 of them are going to be kind of syllabus review questions that we covered on Tuesday. The other 6 will be related to the material that we covered today. Now, there'll be a point today, I'm guessing, we're going to get through stuff quick enough. If not, I'll make sure I mention at the end. But we might have enough time where I'll probably start module 2 today. That just gives us a little bit more time to kind of go a little bit slower next week when we're first really kind of diving into concepts and ideas that are probably a little bit more foreign than what we'll talk about today. So we'll get through module 1 material today. Probably start module 2. So those module readings are always 1 week in advance. So once again, I'm not expecting you to be experts on module 2 material before we start it next week, or we kind of continue if we get to at least start it a little bit today. But it's more a way to prime your brain for the topics we're going to talk about, right? So it's kind of like people are asking, how do I prepare for class to make it more effective? These module readings are something I have built in to help you prepare for that next week's material, okay? Now you get 3 attempts on those assignments. So every question, essentially, you get 3 attempts. It tells you which ones you got right or wrong after each attempt. So, you don't have to be experts. A lot of the times it's a multiple choice question. Some of them are like true or false. Hopefully you get a true or false question correct if you have 3 attempts, right? You really only need 2 attempts there, okay? So they're not meant to be difficult as long as you put a little bit of time and effort into those. Those module readings should be fairly easy. Okay? Just a couple things before we get going as well. I mentioned last class, I posted that collaborative learning poll. So I put up this file, which is the kind of times and locations. So I didn't have the locations available. I updated the first week slides on Canvas as well. So that on that collaborative learning slide where it used to say like TBD or TBA, I've now got the locations that are going to exist. I put them in an Excel spreadsheet as well. So here are CL sessions. Right on Monday, or sorry, on Thursday, or right here, the 3 different locations, and then Monday, here's the 3 different locations available every time slot for those. When you're giving me your preferences, you don't give me a location preference, just a day and time. Okay. Now I will next week eventually post something where I assign you to a specific day, time, and location. If it helps, you don't really have to pay attention to that. Sure. The only reason I'm doing that is because based off of the response I got from you, I can guarantee you a seat in that daytime location. Any week, you can go to whatever daytime location works for you that week, and you can still get the extra credit for attendance. Okay? It's just a way I can guarantee you there will be a seat and try to make sure that we have everything kind of evenly traveled, right? Or kind of equal number of students in each session. I think every single one of these rooms has 50 or 60 seats, so it shouldn't be a big issue anyways. Like whatever one you go to, even though I can guarantee you a seat in whichever one I assign you to, there almost will always be available seats no matter what daytime location you go to. Okay. Is that clear? Any questions on anything I've said up to this point? Okay. So after class today, we'll have that module 2 reading. You'll have that first quiz. When is that quiz due? At the end of the day on Monday. Always do that following Monday before we start class the next day. Or sorry, I should say they're due the day before we have class that starts that next day. Now, quizzes are due at 11:59. When are the module readings actually due? 11:50. That might be a good thing to know going into that first quiz, right? I'm making that differentiation because on Canvas, it'll display that those module readings are due at 11:59. They're actually due at 11:50. When you're on Top Hat, it'll show you 11:50, but Canvas kind of has that slight time discrepancy so that it has time to sync up those grades. Okay. Other than that, it should be everything kind of housekeeping stuff to get out of the way. We'll kind of pick up with our slides. So here today, we left off on slide 14. We'll kind of dive into some actual material. Okay. So when we're thinking about kind of what economics is at its core, right? It's basically how do we make decisions, right? Or how do we allocate our time and resources given the fact that we have a scarce amount of resources. We only have 24 hours in a day. We only have 30 workers at our firm, right? So I face these scarce resources. How do I then make optimal decisions, given that constraint? So why don't you go out and purchase like your ideal car? Like I don't know what my ideal car is. Probably if I had all the money in the world, like a really kind of nice 1978 Trans Am or something that's like fixed up, like that would be like my. Why don't I go out and buy that? Because I only have so much money in my bank account, right? Or why don't you go out and get? My wife loves these those Tesla trucks, or what are they called? Cybertrucks. Why don't we have one? Because they're ridiculously expensive, right? I face a scarce resource of money, so I don't go out and buy that ideal car. So ultimately, what are we doing? We're making decisions. We want to buy things as consumers, or firms would love to produce 1 million units, but they only have so many workers, they only have so many raw materials. And so we have trade-offs to make, right? If I assign one worker to make this good, I can't make enough. Or if I decide to go out and purchase this car, I don't have enough funds to purchase this other car, right? So we have trade-offs when we just choose to do things, right? Because we face scarce time and we face scarce resources like money. So we'll kind of talk through the decision-making process. This is a little bit of, I don't know, probably an easier question that you might see pop up on a quiz. But given that this is an economics course we're starting out, we'll make the differentiation between macro and micro. Okay? So usually it would be in the title of the course. So even though this is Introduction to Economics for Business 1, I would probably, if it were up to me, call this microeconomics, right? This B251 is microeconomics. If you take B252, that's essentially macroeconomics. So what's the difference? So macroeconomics, which we won't really touch on a lot this semester, probably module 2 is about as macroeconomic as we'll get. When we get towards the end of the semester, we might have some examples when we talk about something called game theory, where we start to think about maybe some more macro level topics. But basically macroeconomics, someone I think stopped by my office, I said, it's not a perfect definition, but the way you can think about macroeconomics is anything at the country level, right? So anything that we're looking at, GDP, right? Or, the level of imports, exports at the country level, right? How an economy works within a country or the worldwide economy, those are more macroeconomic issues. So we start to talk about things like inflation, money supply, interest rates. Microeconomics is going to be, well, it's micro. We're going down even further, right? Not at the country level. We're focusing on specific markets. So maybe I'm just looking at, I don't know, the watch market, right? Or I'm looking at just the labor market. Or I'm looking at simply how does an individual make a decision? how does a firm make a decision? That's a much more micro, right? That's kind of way down the line from the overall picture of the country level, right? So we're this semester primarily going to be focused on microeconomic issues. Okay, so I found this at one point, and this is getting to be an older movie at this point, but if you haven't seen Zoolander, you have to watch. I mean, it's just a classic, right? So we're going to be looking at things like firm decisions, individual consumers' decisions. So I'll kind of say module 2 isn't quite, we don't start thinking about consumers, but the majority of the content we go through in this class, it's going to be helpful in that most of us are consumers. We buy things. I doubt many of you are producers, right? You don't own a company where you're producing things. So it's easier when we talk about these consumer decisions. It gets a little bit harder when we start to think about firm decisions because that's just not how we operate day to day. Most of us operate day to day as consumers, and so we're doing a lot of like individual consumer choice stuff. We then can also focus on very specific markets. So maybe I focus on the healthcare market, or I focus on the market for higher education, right? Those are micro level topics. It's not looking at the country overall. So when we start to walk through some of this individual decision making or even firm decision making, we're also going to make this distinction between our self-interest and the social interest. Okay, so what we assume in economics at the very beginning is that everyone is making self-interested decisions, right? You're trying to maximize your own. Why do you buy the things that you buy? Hopefully you're buying them because they make you happy or better off, right? You're trying to maximize your own happiness, or what we'll end up calling utility. So individuals, we're assuming, are making decisions so that they're maximizing their own utility, or for now we can think about they're maximizing their overall happiness. What's the happiness of a firm? Most firms just care about money, right? They're making decisions to maximize their profits. Right? Now, even though we might think about, okay, individuals are making decisions that are in their own self-interest, it could be that when I make a decision, if I'm walking around campus and I got some trash in my hand, for me, maybe to go way out of my way and find a trash can, that's a high cost. Getting rid of it right away provides me a lot of happiness. So I might decide to litter or pollute, right? That's in my self-interest. Is that in the best interest of society? No. Right? So ultimately, we'll start to, throughout the semester, talk about, okay, the people or firms are acting out of their own self-interest. If firms are maximizing profits, what might they do? It's kind of a more higher level of littering, but they start to pollute. Is that in the best interest of society? No. So we might want to say, okay, how do these decisions that are made out of self-interest not result in the maximum social interest? Pollution is probably our easiest example. Now, even though we think about people acting in self-interest, sometimes I'll get some pushback at this point and say, yeah, but I don't just care about myself. It brings me happiness to see other people to help others, right? Or we have nonprofit firms. Well, they're not maximizing profits. A nonprofit is trying to maximize the amount of good that they're doing in the world. They don't care about just dollars and cents, or they don't care just about their own utility. If I have value in helping others, well, that's something that brings me happiness. So even though, sometimes when we act out of self-interest, if we care about the social interest, well, then those two things align. But that's just not always the case. We all know that selfish asshole who just does things that are, only in their best self-interest, right? Companies the same way, okay? So we'll start to talk about this difference between self-interested decisions and how that might not always be what's best for society, okay? So I kind of already brought up in this idea of when I litter, right? I'm always weighing out two things. How much benefit do I get from choosing to do this? And then what is the cost, right? Hopefully, if the benefit is larger than the cost, I choose to do that, right? All of you are here because you think that, the expected future income or the happiness from the job that you can get from attending college, having a college degree, you've decided that benefit outweighs what? The huge cost that it takes to be here. Not only in terms of your tuition, but what are you giving up to get a degree here? On average, 4 years of your life, right? Or a lot of time. So we start to think about people are going to be, and firms are going to be weighing out the costs and benefits. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into those. So the first thing we'll look at are costs. Okay? So costs we usually think about because all of us are consumers, when you go to the store, what would you usually think about the cost of buying something is? So if you were to go, huh? Yeah, whatever the sticker price is on the good that you want to buy. So if I go to buy a gallon of gas, it's however much a gallon of gas costs, right? But inherently, when you choose to do something, when you choose to purchase something, if I take, $100 to buy some nice watch that I want, I am not using that $100 to buy food, right? So there's not only the sticker price I'm paying for the good, I'm also not feeding myself. Well, there's some value to that. So when you choose to do something or choose to spend your money on something, there's also what we call an opportunity cost. What could I have been doing with that money? Or what could I have purchased instead? Or instead, you just think about time. If I choose to go study an additional hour for this course, what am I not doing with that hour? Going and hanging out with my friends. And if I really value going and hanging out with my friends, or let's say, I don't know, on Monday night, you decide to study, what are you giving up? Well, you're not watching the game. And if you really value that, right, that might be a high opportunity cost to you. Okay. So it's not just money. It can also be the time that you're using. You're not using that time to do something else. And the thing that you're not doing, we would call that the opportunity cost. Right? It's what you're giving up. So, you could think about this even in like your decision to go out and get lunch. If I choose to go and get lunch somewhere and spend, it was the same amount of money to eat at Chipotle. Well, what am I not doing? I'm not eating at Chick-fil-A. And if I don't really like Chipotle, and I like Chick-fil-A, I'm giving something up that's a higher value to me. So we'll start to think about these opportunity costs. And I kind of already gave the example of time. This isn't always an interesting one, like, your TikTok usage or whatever social media app you doom scroll on, right? All of that time, you're not using that to do other things that could provide you other happiness, right? So really, what we'll start out with thinking about opportunity costs, we'll really just think about the value of the time you're giving up. I think it'll be an easier kind of place to start. So if you think about, maybe I have this decision. My wife and I were just talking. John Mellencamp's coming to, it's not Ruoff. And is it Ruoff now? They changed it, right? Or is it still Ruoff? You guys are young enough to probably only know it as Ruoff. It's changed a number of times since I've went there. So you decide to go to this concert, right? What is the opportunity cost? Well, if I go to this concert in Indianapolis, what can I not do? I can't pick up a shift wherever I'm working, right? So whatever money I would have made working during that time, that's the opportunity cost of attending that concert. Even if it was completely free, someone just gave me a ticket. There's still, even if there's no sticker price, you can go attend it for free, you still have a cost. It's the cost of whatever you're not doing with your time. In this case, if we think about the easiest way, I'm not going and picking up an extra shift at my job. Okay? So, free lunch, something doesn't cost anything, doesn't mean it's free. Right? The opportunity cost of a decision might incur some additional non-sticker price costs. Okay? So I'll set this up with a rental decision example because I think that'll apply to most of you. Hopefully, if I'm not as in touch with the rental market for college students in Bloomington, but from what I remember when I was in college, if you haven't made a decision for where you're living next year, you really better get on it, right? Things kind of move well in advance. So let's say we're thinking about choosing between apartments, right? So I've got 3 different apartments here. This is how much, and let's say, just for the sake of this example, every apartment is the exact same kind of like amenities, like it's built the same year, the same number of square footage, everything's the same, except for one factor, which we'll talk about in a second. So here's the 3 different apartments, and for some reason they have 3 different rental prices. Right? One of them costs $1,000 a month, $800 and $700. If it was just based off of this, which apartment would you choose? The cheapest one. Right? It has the lowest sticker price, or it has the lowest kind of cost, or what we'll end up calling explicit cost. Okay. So which one would I choose? Well, I would think apartment C. But then what's a real key factor when you're going to think about where you want to live, right, next year? Well, how far away is this from campus? Right? Am I going to have to take a bus in? Can I walk to my classes, etc.? So if we own these apartments, if they were otherwise identical, but they're in different locations, how might that change our decision? Well, if I have an apartment that's way away from campus, it's going to take a lot of time for me to go to and from campus every day. What am I giving up by living in that apartment? A lot of time. If I value my time, I might not choose that apartment, even if it had the lowest rent, right? So we'll kind of build this example out. Let's say I've got each of these apartments, and sure enough, the one that was more expensive happens to be the one that's closer to campus. So if I just think about like my commute time, and I just chose some, easy numbers here. Let's say apartment A is 5 minutes, apartment B is 10, apartment C is 15 minutes away from campus. Over the course of a semester, that's going to cost me X number of hours, right? Just every day walking to and from campus. So we know that if I choose apartment A, I'm giving up way less time than if I choose apartment C. So here's where, it really depends on what apartment am I now going to choose. It depends on how much I value my time. Okay. So we'll walk through some examples, and I think this will make it a little bit more obvious. So let's just say I'm working at a job, and make the number nice and easy. Let's say I'm making $10 an hour. So if I choose these different apartments, and I know that I'm going to have to give up different amounts of time, let's just assume, and maybe this isn't a job I have to go to, it's something I do on the side, so I really can work on it at any time, right? My brother is really got over the pandemic, got really into buying and selling like sports cards, right? You can do that whenever you want, whenever you have free time, okay? And so let's just assume that's what we have, and we make on average $10 an hour. Well, then if I choose these different apartments, here was the amount of time that it was going to take me to walk to and from campus, the total number of hours in the semester I was giving up. Well, if I value each hour at $10, the total amount of my opportunity cost, or the total value of that time I was giving up by living in that apartment, I would just simply multiply that time by 10. So the apartment that was further away from campus, I'm going to incur a larger opportunity cost. I'm giving up more of my time. And as long as I value my time, any value above zero, it's going to have the highest opportunity cost. So if I'm now making this decision about what apartment do I want to live in, I have the rent each month, but I also have how much each month, how much time I'm going to have to give up, and what the value of that time would be to me. Might have misspoke earlier and said over the semester. We're doing things at the week level, right? So if I want my total costs, I'm going to take the rent I have to pay each month, plus whatever my opportunity cost is of the time I have to give up by commuting to and from that location. Okay. So all I did here was I added up the opportunity cost of each apartment. I added up the rent. Now, what apartment has the lowest total cost if I include the opportunity cost? Looks like apartment B has lowest. So if I just made my decision based off of the rent, I would have chosen an apartment that actually had the highest total cost. Right? So this kind of goes as a nice example where it shows if I don't factor in my opportunity costs, I'd actually be making decisions that make me worse off. I'm the best off if I instead make decisions factoring in those opportunity costs of time. Okay. Any questions on this idea of opportunity cost before we keep kind of make things a little bit more complicated here, or add in another wrinkle? Just making sense so far? A couple head nods, okay? So before we work through the numbers, if I value my time, let's say whatever job I could be working, instead of $10, I could make it $20 an hour. If I value my time more, what apartment starts to become more attractive in terms of having a lower cost? Whatever apartment would be closer to campus. So if I really value my time, we should see the decision start to move towards which apartment. I think it was apartment A was the one that was the closest. So here I've got now, I value my time twice as much. So instead of in our earlier example, where we chose apartment B, it should be more likely, might not necessarily choose that, but it should be more likely I now choose that apartment that's closer to campus, because what's going to happen in each one of these opportunity costs? If instead of valuing my time at $10, I value it at 20, the opportunity cost of every apartment is going to go up, right? I'm giving up the same amount of time, but it's now worth more to me. So if I just do those calculations to get the new opportunity costs, I add those in to the rental cost. What apartment now has the lowest total cost to me? Apartment A. And let's say I couldn't work at all, and I valued my time at 0. Well, then the decision becomes easy, because what do I go back to? My opportunity cost, my value time at $0, my opportunity cost of the time I'm giving up would actually be 0. So the only thing that matters is the rent, right? Now, that line. There's no example where anybody really values their time at $0, right? So we're always going to have some opportunity cost that we should be factoring in. I'm just kind of using the extreme to kind of make a point there. Okay. All right. So with this idea in mind, we can think about the opportunity cost of making a decision, and often that's kind of the value of the time that you're giving up, right? But let's say I wanted to calculate, instead of opportunity costs, I wanted to calculate something that we call marginal costs. So people, firms, everything that we look at, everyone's making decisions with what we call marginal analysis. We don't necessarily look at the total benefit and the total cost when we make decisions. We make decisions based off of the additional benefit and the additional costs. Okay? So we're going to start talking about marginal cost. The word marginal just means the change in. Okay? So if I think about, if I had those total costs here, and this I think was using the time value of $20 and maybe I just made these numbers up just to kind of make it a little bit easier. So let's say we went through the opportunity costs, calculated them. We had these different apartments, and here we kind of have the commuting costs. Here's our total cost. So I think I changed this from our earlier example. Let's assume every apartment has the same rent. So they're all $1,000 a month, but that they still have different distances, right? So I've got different commuting costs. I calculated my total cost. If I was choosing, let's say I'm currently living in this apartment right here, right? My total cost each month is $1,120. If I instead move to apartment number 2, what's the change in my total cost? It's going from 1,120 to 1,240. So the change in my cost would be $120. That would be my marginal cost. The change in my cost if I decide to move from my current apartment to this other one. And the reason why is because if rent is the same, but it's further away from campus, all I'm doing by choosing to go to that apartment that's further away, I would be increasing my opportunity cost. I'm changing my marginal costs. Or I'm changing my costs, so those are my marginal costs. If I instead chose to go from my current apartment to apartment 3, what would my marginal cost be of moving to apartment 3? Well, there the change in my total costs would be $240. Right? So we can calculate opportunity costs, calculate total costs, and then think about if I change my decision, I'm changing my decision. How does that change my costs? That change in my total cost is what we call our marginal cost. So these are just some kind of definitional stuff when we start to think about decision making here in a second. So we can start to think about things like, well, what's the marginal cost of studying for an additional hour? Well, it depends. In my example, I was thinking about the cost of time is like if I was working at a job. So how much money could I be making? But let's say I don't have a job. If I choose to study for an additional hour, what's the marginal cost of that? Well, what's the opportunity cost? I mentioned a little bit earlier. If I study for an hour, I'm not using that hour to do something else I like, right? So whatever I'm not doing, maybe it's hanging out with friends. What's the cost then of choosing to study an hour? It's kind of weird. But what am I not doing? I'm not hanging out with my friends. So the cost of studying would actually be however much I value hanging out with my friends, or however much benefit hanging out with my friends would bring me because I'm no longer doing that. Right? So that would be kind of my opportunity cost, or the additional cost in this case of choosing to study for 1 more hour. The marginal cost of using that 1 hour to study. What about kind of driving? I always think about, I guess time would factor in here, but another way of thinking about this is, if I'm driving my car, what's one of the marginal costs of driving? What does it take to drive a car? I guess this isn't a perfect example anymore. For most cars, the gas you need to run, or the electricity that you had to pay for it, right? So it doesn't just have to be that your marginal costs include opportunity costs. Your marginal costs could still include these explicit costs or the differences in the sticker price or whatever you had to pay for that good. Okay? So we've got this idea of costs. We're thinking about now factoring in opportunity costs. We know that marginal cost decisions are the change in my total cost from making that decision. The other thing that we want to weigh out, well, I said at this very core, we're weighing out costs and benefits. So if we care about marginal costs, right, the change in my total cost, we're going to compare that to our marginal benefits. Okay? So if marginal cost is the change in the cost from choosing to do something, marginal benefit is going to be the change in the benefit from choosing to do something, right? So usually we think about, we'll start thinking about this in terms of marginal benefits, like if I buy one more unit of a good, right? But you can think about it in other contexts as well. So if I accept a job offer, so like let's say you get to the end of your Kelly career, you're a senior, you choose to accept a job offer, what's the marginal benefit to accepting that job offer? Why do you want that job? Because you have a salary, right? So the marginal benefit of accepting that job is going to be the additional money that you would make accepting that job offer. Now, it may not be that easy because what might you also do? Accept a job, you get paid to do it, but you also might really enjoy it, right? So the value of that job might be the salary plus some additional happiness that you get just from enjoying that job, right? So there's plenty of people with econ degrees that could go out and work for a company. I don't like to do that because I don't value those high stress environments. I enjoy talking with people. I enjoy kind of seeing the light bulb moments of students who aren't. And so why do I have, what's the marginal benefit to me of having this job? Well, yes, they pay me, right? But I also get value because I enjoy it, right? So we start not to just factor in dollars, right, into our marginal benefit, but also kind of the happiness that it brings us. So a working additional hour, same kind of idea. That one, I think if we're thinking about like an hour, if I go back to when I was younger, I worked at for all intents and purposes, it was like a Lowe's, right? Working out in the yard, stacking like lumber and driving forklifts. I didn't really necessarily enjoy that job, right? So the happiness it brought me was pretty much zero. So what was the marginal benefit? My hourly wage rate, right? So sometimes it can be as simple as kind of money. A lot of times we'll think about money plus additional happiness. So for companies, they're just profit maximizing. If they sell one more unit of their good, they sell one more gallon of gas, what's their marginal benefit? However much money they're making by selling that gallon of gas. So about $3 a gallon right now or whatever it is. I kind of already mentioned this one. We can also start to answer some pretty interesting questions, right? So if I'm thinking about people, and I grew up on a Lake Michigan, and let's say there's two houses, right? One of them is right on the beach, and one of them is right behind it. Let's say it's the exact same house. Which house do you think is going to sell for more? The house that's right on the beach. Why? Because you can wake up every morning and look at the sunrise over the lake. If you're the house right behind that, what do you get to look at? The house right in front of you, right? So the difference that people are willing to pay for those two houses, if they were exactly the same, that would tell you the what? How much people value that view, right? Or the marginal benefit of switching to that house, the difference in the amount that people would be willing to pay would be, well, what's the additional benefit of being able to see that view in the morning looking over the lake as opposed to just looking at another house? So we can start to think about this. I've got another example here I think I'll run with. Let me see if I remember the order of my slides correctly. Yes, I do. So we'll use this example. And this is where I'll start to get some practice. You'll get some practice more with me switching back and forth between this dot cam. So let's see here. So let's say on a day like today, this example might not make a lot of sense because it's frigid and cold. But let's say this is like the middle of July, 90-degree day. I'm out, doing yard work and it's extremely hot. I've worked for a couple hours. I come in and I want, to drink a beer, right? I'm telling you, the amount of money I would pay if I didn't have any in my fridge, I would pay my neighbor to just have a beer after something like that, would be pretty high, right? So when we think about what's the additional benefit it would bring me from consuming that first beer after this long, hot day of work, right? Well, I might be willing to pay a really high price, or the additional benefit that would bring me quenches my thirst, cools me down. It's beer, so it gives me a little buzz, right? Maybe I would have a pretty high marginal benefit. Right? Now, once I consume that first one, right, my thirst is kind of already quenched, right? I'm cooling down a little bit, but maybe I'd want a second, right? However, when I consume that second unit or that second beer, is the marginal benefit as high as that first one? No, right? Or I can give you a different example that might make it a little more sense. If I don't own a car and I go out and I purchase a car, what benefit does that bring to my life? In a town like Bloomington, where you can't walk to everything, it's a huge marginal benefit to my life, right? But once I have one car, what's the marginal benefit of having a second? I'm only one person, so really not that I can only drive one car at a time. Maybe I like this additional car to drive around. Maybe it's a Jeep and I can take the top off when it's a nice day out. So maybe there is some marginal benefit, but compared to the first car I own, the marginal benefit's a lot lower. So typically we think about as we buy more of something, well, the very first unit I bought is going to give me the highest marginal benefit. And then the next unit, the marginal benefit is a little bit lower. And then the third, a little bit lower. In fact, I would argue, my wife would probably confirm this, if I get out to like 4 or 5 beers after I've worked out in the yard, maybe that marginal benefit at some point starts to become negative, right? I'm not doing other things in my day that I should be doing, right? So we think about as we choose to purchase something, the number of units we buy, the marginal benefit of each additional unit is going to go lower and lower, right? And we call this the diminishing returns. We'll focus a little bit more on this later on, but for right now, when you think about typically as we consume more of something, that marginal benefit is declining. My car example, I think, is a more extreme example that really kind of helps solidify that idea, right? So we've got this kind of decreasing marginal benefit or diminishing marginal benefits, right? With that idea in mind, right, we can also start to do things like how do we make optimal decisions? Okay? So let's say I had a slightly different example, and I'm instead thinking about, let's see if I can get enough room up here. There we go. Let's say I'm thinking about, I don't know. We'll do video games here, right? So the number of hours that I'm spending playing video games, right? Well, the first hour I spend, right, it helps me unwind. So I'm thinking about the kind of marginal benefit here. Maybe that's relatively high. And then as I choose to spend more and more time, so here we're not purchasing a good, but we're using our time to do something. When we purchase a good, right, we have scarce resources of money. Here I have a scarce resource of time. So we would still have kind of the same idea that as I spend more and more time, the third hour, the fourth hour, that marginal benefit of each additional hour is decreasing. If I'm thinking about time, kind of simplified example, what am I not doing with that time if I'm playing video games? Not using it to study, work a job. So an easy example would be to think about if instead, like I wasn't in college, like let's just say I was, I don't know, at home playing video games and I've got like a minimum wage job. Well, what's the value of that hour that I'm using to spend playing video games? If I could be using it to work, you could almost think about it as whatever my kind of hourly wage rate is. So for that first hour, when we start to think about how many hours would be optimal for me to spend playing video games? Okay. Well, if I take that first hour, the additional benefit I get is relatively high. In fact, it's greater than, well, if this is my opportunity cost, if it's an hourly wage rate, it's always the same. So this would also represent my marginal cost. Every hour I'm giving up, the cost to me is how much money I could have been making at my hourly wage rate job. So for the first hour, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So if the additional benefits to something are greater than the additional cost, will I choose to do it? Yeah, you can think about it as, what am I really trying to maximize when I make decisions? My net benefits. My net benefits would be the difference between my marginal benefits and my marginal costs. So as long as this net benefit is greater than 0, I'm better off choosing to do that thing, to spend that hour doing that activity, purchase that good, whatever the decision is, right? If the additional benefit, marginal benefit, is greater than the additional cost, my net benefits, right, I'm better off. So if I rearrange this equation, what is this really saying? As long as my marginal benefits of choosing to buy or to spend an hour doing something, as long as those marginal benefits are greater than marginal costs, I'm better off. And if I'm trying to maximize my own happiness, I should choose to do something that's making me better off, right? In terms of the benefits are greater than the additional benefits are greater than the additional costs. So if I'm looking at this on a graph, for the first hour, is the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost? Yes, so I would choose to spend an hour playing video games. What about the second unit? Looks like the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost, so yes. What about the third? Looks like just barely, but yes. Well, what if I get out here to the fourth hour? What has now happened? At that fourth hour, the additional benefit I get from playing video games is now less than the additional costs. So what would happen to this net benefit? If the marginal benefit is now less than the marginal cost, this value would be negative. I'm actually worse off if I choose to play video games for that fourth hour. So I wouldn't play the fourth hour. I would stop at 3. That would be my optimal decision. So when we talk about what's the optimal number of units or the optimal amount of time to spend on an activity, we're going to go up to the point where the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. As soon as that marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, we won't choose to do that. Right? Set it up in a slightly different way. So any questions on this before we kind of keep moving here? Brad? So in this class, we'll be drawing a lot of graphs, right? In fact, when it comes to quizzes and exams, I talked to some people yesterday during office hours, rote memorization isn't going to go very far in this class because we're going to have a lot of things and it's going to be very hard for you to rote memorize all of them. Being able to build out conceptually these different models or these graphs I'm drawing for you, this is going to go a long way, right? So that's why this isn't in the recorded lectures, right? This is what you should be taking notes on when we're in class, okay? And it's great to kind of take a picture or have the end result, but I think the process of like drawing it out and building it with me is going to be a lot more beneficial, okay? So behind every graph, if it's X and Y values, you could also have a what? Like basic high school math, I think. If you have a graph, how was I getting those points? They could come from a table of values, right? So we can think of things not just in terms of a graph, but also in terms of a table. So let's say we instead now think about, I want to know how many units or what quantity, so I'm going to write Q here. You want to kind of above it, think about the quantity or the number of units I buy of a specific good. Okay. Well, we already said what good is going to have the highest marginal benefit, or what unit? The very first one that I purchased. The first car I purchased, extremely high marginal benefit for my life. As I buy more and more, what's happening to the marginal benefit? It is declining. Okay. So we'll kind of think about an example here, and I'll just choose some numbers to make this a little bit easier. So let's say, as I buy more of this good, the additional benefit I get is decreasing. Well, what do we want to compare that marginal benefit to if I'm making a decision? I need to say, is the additional benefit greater than the, let's be careful, marginal cost, right? I know that you probably were thinking that, but I want to be very specific, right? When we go through, so we weigh out, we compare it to that marginal cost. Now, I drew an example earlier where that marginal cost was constant. But if you think about it, if I'm using money to buy something, what am I going to do? So let's say I go out and I spend $100 on something. What is the opportunity cost of spending $100? Whatever I could have purchased with it. But what are the things I'm going to give up first? Things that I don't really like, right? So if I went out and spend a bunch of money, I'm going to start not purchasing things like, I don't know, Starbucks coffee. I don't really necessarily like them. They're kind of a nice thing to go get on a Saturday morning, but I don't really care much about them. I'll take the money I spent on, I don't know, a new car, and I just won't get Starbucks. But eventually, if I want to buy a second car, I now have to give up something that I value even more, right? I'll start giving up things that I don't care about, but eventually I'd have to start giving up things that I do care about. So if I'm giving something up, that is my what type of cost? What I'm not doing with that money represents my opportunity cost. So as I buy more units of something, I have to not buy other goods. I'm first going to give up things I don't value very much, so my marginal cost is going to be relatively small. But as I buy more and more of this good, I'm going to have to start giving up things I actually do care about. So my opportunity cost is going to be getting higher, right? So generally, we would think about as we buy more of something, we're having to actually, oh, I'm going to change these numbers to make a point. So what do I want here? Start these here. There we go. Should have done the same thing, but I think this will be more helpful to you when you get to quiz. Okay. So my marginal costs, because I'm giving up things I value more and more, should be increasing. Right? So when we're drawing things out in the graph, we'll eventually start to get to depictions where if I were to just plot these points out, what is this going to look like? I can get these papers to unstick. All right. So we already had in before, if I spend more time, but now I'm just purchasing different units of some good, my marginal benefits are decreasing, but my marginal costs are increasing. So for every unit in this range, the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. So am I going to choose to purchase these units? Well, if the additional benefit is greater than the additional cost, yes. What about the number of units over here in this range? What's true about the marginal benefit relative to the marginal cost for all of these units? The additional costs are greater than the additional benefit. So will I buy any of these units? No. So here's where there's a slight, caveat to what I was saying before. Yes, we choose to do something or buy a good if the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. But there's one small statement we also threw at the end. We actually choose to do something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to. The point where they're equal is where we know we'll stop. If they're equal, what's the net benefit of choosing to buy that good? 0. So we would say, am I any better or worse off? No. So we say people are indifferent. They'll spend up to or use their time up to that point. We know they won't go past it because then the marginal benefits will become less than the marginal cost. So if instead of a nice kind of graph like this, if we have it in table form, I would argue in some ways it's easier because what do I have to do? So do I buy this good? Well, the very first unit is the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost. Yes, so I'll buy that good, right? For the second unit, is the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost? 18 is greater than 14, so yes, I'll buy that unit. Will I buy the third? Well, the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost. So what we say is people will spend up to the point where they're equal. So if you were asked a question like this on a quiz or an exam, the optimal number of units, you would buy up to the point where they're equal. So we would buy these first 3. Will I buy the fourth unit? Is the marginal benefit greater than the marginal cost? No, right? So I won't buy the fourth. Now, do I have to keep going? Well, if the marginal benefit was less than the marginal cost of the fourth unit, what's happening to the marginal benefits as I buy more? They're becoming lower. The marginal costs are becoming higher. So that gap is just going to get even larger. Once I identify the very first unit that I won't buy, I know that I'm not going to buy any number of units past that. Right? If I won't buy the fourth one, I'm definitely not going to buy the fifth. And I definitely won't buy the sixth, and etc. So you can be asked these questions, or we can kind of do this analysis using a graph or using a table with actual values. Somewhere over here, I had a question. It doesn't necessarily have to be. Anything that we use. So if I were to give you a table, maybe I wouldn't make it linear, just kind of, you could still use the same concept. Any graph that I shouldn't say any graph. Most of the graphs that we use in this class are going to, we'll have some that we look at that aren't linear, but I won't ask you to do anything like take a derivative to figure out that, right? So for the most part, if we're talking about slopes, we'll kind of, if I'm going to ask you to calculate the slope, it'll be linear. If we have nonlinear graphs, it's usually going to be more conceptual. right? So no, won't necessarily always be linear when we're looking at these values like on a table, right? But in terms of kind of the graphs that I'm using, I'll kind of use linear graphs here for this first module. Later on in the semester, we will start to touch on things that aren't linear. Any other questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. All right. So this is where usually in the slides, if I leave things blank, even if it's in the skeleton slides, that doesn't necessarily mean something's going to be posted there in the complete version. Sometimes I leave these slides open, to be completely honest, to remind myself there's some things I want to draw up for you, right? Or usually it's a way to indicate to you, if you missed class, oh, I missed something here, right? There was likely some things that I was drawing on the dot cam that were important, okay? So let's kind of round out this idea, or kind of round out this chapter. A couple other concepts we'll talk about. So we're going to start to make statements throughout the semester that are what we call positive or normative. So positive statements are statements of fact or what we see people actually do. Maybe usually this is going to be like, what do we see actually in the data, right? So these are going to be things that are like cold hard facts. This is something that we have data on. These are the decisions that people are making, okay? So if I go out and maybe I look at the data and say on average, people are saving 5% of their overall income. That's just a statement of fact I can get from some data, okay? Normative statements are going to be what people should do. So when we go through this marginal analysis, what's really interesting is there's actually things people do in their everyday lives, and this is likely because they're not correctly evaluating marginal benefits and marginal costs. In fact, a lot of people, when they make decisions, they aren't good at factoring in their opportunity costs, right? And so a lot of times when we look at data or make a positive statement, what are people actually doing? It might not coincide with what they actually should be doing to maximize their overall happiness, right? So normative statements are going to be more of like, here's what the theory says people should do. A positive statement is here's what people are actually doing, okay? So normative, you can think about just like opinions. So maybe people are on average saving 5% of their income, but when we look at how much it takes, people are living longer. And so when we actually look at how much money you need to survive after you retire, maybe we actually have models that suggest you should be saving more than 5% of your annual income if you want to retire still at the age of 65, right? Because if you're living longer, healthcare costs are going up. Once you retire, you now need more money, right? So this is a normative statement. What do we see people actually doing? That's our positive statement, okay? So, normative economics, that's just like your opinion, right? These are opinions that we're making. You guys haven't watched The Big Lebowski. These memes sometimes I'll line up. It's also a way for me to give you some things that you should definitely make sure you're doing. You're getting young enough compared to me now that some of these references I make might completely go over your head. But if you haven't seen The Big Lebowski, look up this movie. It's a classic. Okay. So, economics also is worth mentioning before we kind of continue on the semester. It is what we call a social science, right? It's not like biology or chemistry, and we don't think about it as a science. But ultimately, I've already been drawing graphs. I have tables like it at its core, it is a science, right? So we still follow this scientific method. So with this idea of normative and positive statements, typically our normative statements come from some theoretical model that we have, right? I've got a model and it suggests people should be saving more than 5% of their income for retirement. I designed some experiment to test this. Usually in economics, this is really easy. It's just going out and gathering data of what people are actually doing. But there is a whole sector of economics, which is called experimental economics, where they actually design ways to test these theories in a computer lab, right? And give people like artificial budgets and ask them like, how much would you buy? Give you kind of artificial costs and benefits. And so usually this step is we just go out and collect data. We then take that data and we say, okay, once we have this data, does our positive statement, people are only saving 5% of their income. That doesn't match up with our theory. So if the data, what people are doing, doesn't match up with the theory, what might be a problem? You might have the wrong theory. Maybe people don't just care about dollars and cents. I don't care if I don't live off as much money once I retire, if I really value not having to go to work every day, right? Maybe my model didn't factor in that I'm okay living on like a lower level of quality of life. I can't buy as many, new things, but I'm okay with that because I really value not having to work, right? So maybe my model didn't factor in the happiness that was coming from not working. So once we have that data, we'll kind of look back at our theory. If they don't line up, we then adjust our theory, go out, collect the data, now see if the data matches up with our new theory, right? So we basically will still follow the scientific method. Now, in this class, we won't dive too deep into what this process looks like. A lot of the time, we're just going to be focusing on kind of step one, right? And then usually I'll mention kind of in step two or give you examples where we can see that people's decisions are matching up with the theory. Now, the next level of economics would be then, okay, if it doesn't match up, how do we adjust those theories? What are some things we might not be factoring in? Okay. Also, one thing that I usually forget to kind of throw this in, we're in module 3 and module 2. I will often remember to say this because we're just starting out. As the semester progresses, I will forget to add this kind of little term on at the end of most statements I make, which is we are going to be trying to analyze the relationship between two things quite often. So how much of a good someone buys given the marginal benefits and marginal costs, right? When in my example earlier, when I was saying that there's two houses, one's on the lake, one's right behind it. Well, in order to determine what the marginal value of that view was, what did I actually say? I said the houses were exactly the same. Or this idea of ceteris paribus. When I just want to know the value of the view of the house, I have to make sure nothing else about those houses are different. That's hard to do in real life. In fact, if we really want to do that, we have to kind of move to some higher level statistics. A lot of you will take like E370, and that's because we need to come up with statistical ways where we can hold all these other factors constant, right? So this is the idea of we're trying to do a lot of these models. We're focusing on the relationship between, say, variable X and variable Y, or just these two things. We've got to hold everything else constant, okay? So with this idea in mind, that we want to look at ultimately cause and effect relationships. We don't just want to care about things if they're correlated. We want to know, is X causing Y to change? Okay. Now, this will be a little bit less of the focus of this class. We'll look at the theory in terms of the data side of things. We won't really dive into it, but that's ultimately where we'll be going in economics. This course kind of helps you build those theories. The next level, like a 370, helps you build the statistical tools to be able to test those theories with some actual data. I put a link up here. Let's see, I think if I exit out of this, it makes it easier for the computer to pull this up. So we've got the spinning wheel of death. We'll see if this pops up. If not, I'll kind of just keep. Okay, well, now I've broken PowerPoint, so we'll give this another. There we go. All right. So there's just an article. If you're interested, you can kind of read through it. It kind of has like some different measures of tuition, kind of what the cost of college is. And so I had this idea earlier of what's the value of kind of a college degree, right? Or why are you here? It's because even though you're spending a lot of money, you're using a lot of your time, you hope that in the future, it gets you a job that you enjoy more and that pays you more, right? So you can kind of do these like back of the envelope or kind of these simple examples. So let's say we have this theory and it predicts that the value of a college education, it's going to increase your wages by 50%, right? So if that's our theory, right, that we're working with, that's kind of step one. We then go out and collect data, all right? So from this article, they had some numbers. I actually think I went out to the Bureau of Labor Statistics to get these numbers. And they do everything for like over the age of 25, so it kind of excludes, right, college students. Your income is all relatively low. So we're only looking at people who have the opportunity to already get a college degree, comparing that to those who don't. So if I look at those who just have a high school diploma, after the age of 25, their average kind of weekly earnings is about $853. Weekly earnings of someone with a college degree, and this is in the United States, on average is $1,400. Now, this varies state to state. This is just kind of an average of the country. But if we use these values, what is the actual return to a college degree? Well, what percent of an increase will be going from 853 to 1,432? We can kind of just do a simple ratio and see, well, that's actually a 68% increase. Well, if our model predicted there was a 50% increase, does the data match up with that prediction? No, it's a little bit off. It's a little bit higher, right? Our data actually suggests, in terms of just the dollars, right, that the return to a college education or the return to a college degree is actually much greater than 50%. It's 68%. And then I think I went out, I had some old data. So what we would, sorry. If I use data, I try to put the source in there. I couldn't remember if I did. So if you're wondering where I got these numbers, you can click on this link. It'll take you to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They got a bunch of different data. So one thing that I'll use those Canvas discussions for, I mentioned on Tuesday, is we'll start actually looking at data sets. I'll give you some different sources where you can start to actually work with, because we're not going to need like high level statistics, but you can actually see how do I access and how do I navigate a database. I also try to put up sources throughout the semester. If you have additional time, this is something that's probably worth looking at this data source, kind of searching around. How can you find, could you find out where I found these weekly kind of salary amounts, right? Or these weekly earnings? Because I can guarantee you, if you want to be in Kelly, you're going to have to start working with a bunch of different data sources, right? So this isn't the focus of this class, but I try to sprinkle in as much as I can, because we live in a world where you're going to have to be working with data, right? It just is what it is, right? So especially, I shouldn't say that. You want to be within a business kind of environment, you're going to be working with data. I guess if you want to be like I don't know, I pick on my sister a lot, but she was like an anthropology major. And if you want to be kind of this, work in these hippie kind of sectors, and maybe you don't need to work with as much data, but for all of you, my audience that I'm talking to right now, you're going to be working with data, okay? I also updated this because they had some newer values put out. So usually there's a little bit of a lag in terms of how quickly they get data out. So I just saw before we started the semester, they put out the 2024 data. 2025, it just ended, so it's not out yet. But I actually kind of plugged in the same values, or plugged in the new values, and it actually ends up being the exact same return, which is actually kind of nice because it's showing us like there's a pretty consistent return to a college degree, right? It's not varying from 2023 to 2024. It's a little bit different, like to the second decimal, it looks the same. If you actually make this calculation, you'll see it's like a little bit different out to the third or fourth decimal. But, this just goes to highlight, you all are making, if you care about just salary, you're making an optimal decision, right? Your returns to this college degree are going to be pretty high, okay? Did I forget a slide? Oh, well, this is worth me at least going through. So even though I just showed you that there is a kind of high return to this college degree, when I'm looking at these values and these numbers, what did I say? These were average weekly earnings. They vary across state, they vary across individuals. And so we're going to be making a lot of statements throughout the semester where we're making a statement based off of the average, all right? Just because the average is true doesn't mean for any one person that a college degree is going to result in them having higher earnings. So, for example, if I went and got a college degree, not to pick on any, but if I got a 4-year degree and I went to like a community college, maybe an Ivy Tech, is that going to open up as many doors? Is that likely going to increase my salary as much as like a degree from Kelly? Probably not. And in fact, even if I get a degree from Ivy Tech, and it took me 4 years to do it, if I like just barely made it through, I just got C's in all of my classes, and I'm really not that great of a worker to begin with, there could be people who didn't go to college, just started working right away. They're the more effective workers. They could actually end up earning a higher salary than I am, right? So even though on average, individuals with a college degree are earning more, for any two individuals that we compare, that might not necessarily be the case, right? There's a lot of other factors that we were holding constant, that if they varied, when we look at any one specific example, it may not be this, may not line up with the average, okay? So, the example is, there's plenty of people, what's the return if we just looked at Bill Gates or Zuckerberg, them getting a degree? Well, they're making way more, right? They're influencing that, they're going to be way different than the mean, right? And so for any one individuals, these statements we're making about the mean may not be true, okay? So really, ultimately, what this gets at is we're going to be making statements throughout the semester that there is a correlation when we're looking at the data. We won't dive into the theory that we look at. We'll talk about the causal relationships, but it won't really focus on We won't focus on the difference between correlation and causation in terms of data. The data that we look at, we're just picking up correlations. The way that you go from correlations to causation so that you can match your data up to the theory that we'll talk about. All the theory we talk about will be causal relationships. Those tools you'll learn in something like 370. So I don't think I already spoiled it here, but right, if we look at the data, drowning deaths and temperature are drowning deaths and ice cream sale are highly positively correlated. Do you think anyone would argue that ice cream is causing kids to drown? Right? No. It's that there's an outside factor that's causing both of these to be higher, which is when it's hot, people buy more ice cream. And when it's hot, people are more likely to be swimming. And subsequently, we have more drowning deaths. Right? So we ultimately don't care if we just have things that are correlated. We want to know, is there a causal relationship? Our theories will all base off our statements off of trying to identify causal relationships. But in the data aspect of this course, we're really just going to be able to pick up correlations. We move to causal relationships. That's where we're going to take subsequent courses after this. Okay. So where are we at in time? We got 10 minutes here. Do I want to dive into module 2 stuff? I think we'll hold off. It's the first week. Maybe I'll give you a little bit of ease into things. Before I let you get out of here, this is going to apply to most classes. Even though I start to do things or say things that kind of signal class might be ending soon, there still are likely important things that I'm going to say. So before you start to make a ton of noise, and I'll typically keep talking, and if you don't hear it, that's that's on you. I might also, if I'm having a bad day, I might get irritated and say, all right, we're not quite done yet, right? But it's because I know that usually I want to end class with some things that are probably important, right? And usually I'll be revisiting things that I mentioned at the beginning, which is what I'm going to do today. So I have now published that module 2 read. It is due by 11:50 on Monday. There are no late assignments accepted, right? So you need to make sure you get on and get this done, okay? At 11 a.m., this quiz, week 1's quiz, is set to be released. So you can access it after 11 a.m. today, all the way until the end of the day on Monday, okay? Also, just a word of advice. If you're at a presentation or you start to leave early, do you think I'm going to take that very well? I don't really care because, ultimately, you guys can do what you want. But if you're in, a presentation at Kelly and you do something like that, do you think that that's going to open or close doors for you with whoever's presenting? It's not going to open it, right? And so, I try to give you some advice kind of throughout the semester. All of you are in a school of business, right? You're going to have to follow certain, and Kelly will do a much better job than I do because I'm not as stringent on this type of stuff. But you're going to want to try to be as respectful as possible, right? Because ultimately, if someone that I see leave early every single class reaches back out to me and wants a letter of recommendation, if I'm being completely honest, can I say that, can I give them the most glowing recommendation? No, they take off early others, right? Now, I'm not connecting these dots, things like that. But if you're in much smaller classrooms, and trust me, I've met a lot of professors around campus that they're a lot more punitive than I ever would imagine that you could be. You don't want to close those doors, right? So try to give me, it's a minute or two. I've now had to take more time to explain things because I had a handful of people that were taking off early, right? But just some word of advice, pay attention. We'll get out of this even quicker. So once you start that quiz, 60 minutes to complete it. It's due by the end of the day on Monday. So those are the 2 things that you should be doing by the end of the day Monday. And also by the end of the day Sunday, if you could please fill out that collaborative learning poll so that before we meet in class on Tuesday, I can get you all sorted. Kind of make sure that we know what the days, times, and locations are for those CL sessions. Other than that, I will not have office hours on Monday since Martin Luther King Day with the day off. I will replace those with office hours next Friday. You'll likely see an announcement on Canvas that mentions this. Other than that, I'll get this lecture posted to YouTube as well. Have a fun, safe weekend, and I will see you guys on Tuesday.